Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Jackie Iverson. I'm the founder of Health Schema, the digital health wallet aimed at bringing personalized medicine as a mainstream practice by bringing a 360-degree view of your healthcare journey so that you can make informed decisions in partnership with your doctors and care providers. Part of the 360 of your healthcare journey, this podcast series feature well-rounded healthcare-related topics that are meant to elevate your whole health. Today, I have a very special guest, my friend Tanya Frazier. Tanya is a clinical trial research consultant for over 20 years. She's been in the field working for various big pharma names. Hi, Tanya. Welcome. I'm so thrilled to have you join me in this episode of Health Schema podcast.
Thank you. I appreciate the warm welcome.
Well, first and foremost, please explain to us what a clinical trial is.
Well, if you think back to when you were in school and you were in science class and you did science experiments, you start with a hypothesis, a theory, and then you do a series of experiments to try to prove what your hypothesis is. So essentially, a clinical trial is a gigantic science experiment. So we have a hypothesis, and let's say somebody has diabetes, and we have a new compound that we think might help treat that condition. And so then there's a series of experiments done, and either your theory is proven or disproven. So that's the most basic explanation of what a clinical trial is. So the difference in clinical trials outside of the science room is that all the experiments are usually done on living things, whether it's a cell line, an animal, or a human being.
Great. So tell us a little bit about yourself. Why did you choose a career in clinical trial? Were you really good in science as a kid?
I love science. I always ask the question, why? I went to college on a basketball scholarship and got a microbiology degree. And so I was en route to medical school, but my mom became ill and needed my assistance. So I had to find kind of plan B. Back then, nobody went to school to be a clinical researcher. You kind of just fell upon it. So I started out initially in the clinic with a doctor in different doctor's offices, taking patients through the clinical trials. And then I moved up the ladder and became the person who reviewed the records in the doctor's office to make sure everybody was doing everything correctly, the data was solid, that kind of stuff. And then I moved into management.
Oh, nice. So actually, I didn't know that piece about you. Basketball star. So was it, is there a team we can look up?
I went to the University of Memphis, but that's like a million years ago.
Oh, come on. You're saying you're old? We're the same age. That's
okay.
Not nice.
I'm okay with that. We've earned every one of those years. Okay.
Great. So, you probably lost count, but do you have an idea of how many clinical trial projects you've been part of throughout your career up till now?
Yeah. No, I lost count. It's hundreds.
Wow.
And it's also it's really hard to say because you might do one task for this whole 10-year project, and so that's not really fair to say, yeah, well, I really worked on that project because, you contributed, but you weren't the primary player,
Yeah. Wow, hundreds. That's very impressive already. So tell us a little bit about the different phases of clinical trial.
Well, so first, as I mentioned before, clinical research is usually in the clinical setting, and so that involves human beings. But before it gets to the clinic, where it starts out is in idea. And so there's development and compound research on if it's a pharmaceutical or if it's a device. It could be a device, or it could be a biologic, or it could be a vaccine. So these things all kind of start in someone's brain, usually in someone's lab. And so then they kind of prove their concept in the preclinical phase. And then we go to the first clinical phase, which is phase 1. Phase 1 usually involves under 100 subjects. So when you're in a clinical trial, you're not referred to as a patient because you're essentially a test,
A specimen.
right? Or investigational subject, right?
Uh-huh.
So there'll be under 100 subjects, most commonly between 20 and 100. Some of the trials that I've worked on, though, in phase 1, they've only had up to like 20 subjects. So in that phase, what they're really trying to make sure, and they're usually healthy volunteers, so these people don't have the condition that the medication would treat, so they're not really getting any benefit from the trial. So they're compensated for their time and that kind of thing. So during that trial phase, they're looking to make sure it works, the medication, device, what have you, works the way that they hypothesized that it would work, and that it's safe. Then sometimes they're looking for the dose, but more often times they really end up fine-tuning where the dosing is going to be in phase 2. So another difference between phase 1 and phase 2 is everyone in phase 1 is getting an active product. Then phase 2, typically phase 2 is a double-blind randomized trial, which means neither the patient nor the doctor or other people working at the clinic know if the patient is getting the active product or not.
Placebo. And
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's
right. Or sometimes there's a different comparator. Like if there's a new statin coming on the market, then you might compare that statin to the one that's most prescribed. So then at the end, you can say our statin is better than this statin.
I see. So then what type of attributes do you collect? I would assume some genetics data.
No, typically not. So in phase 2, it's usually like 1 to 200, sometimes 300 subjects. And what you're looking at is you're looking at safety data. You're looking at pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics. That means how does the compound, if it's an oral medication or injectable or topical, how does that work once it gets in the body? How long does it take to be excreted from the body? What system excretes it? Does it have any bad side effects? Like, is it going to cause kidney damage or liver damage, or does it make their hair fall out? Funny story on this one. It's kind of how Viagra came to be. So back in the day, they were using Viagra as a cardiac medication.
I had heard of that.
And then all of a sudden they noticed, ooh, there's a new side effect, and it's a very beneficial side effect for both women and men, but especially men.
I see. I see. So some drugs have been discovered by accident as side effects.
Right.
Fascinating.
Right.
So, I'm surprised you didn't mention pharmacogenomics as an attribute because, I feel like it would only cover half of the realm of the person, because there's also epigenetics. You don't know about their diets, their environment. So then it's very broad.
In studies in which those things are investigated, it usually doesn't come about until phase 3 or phase 4.
Gotcha.
So right now we're just trying to make sure this works and it's not going to kill somebody.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Yeah.
And then we're going to move on to kind of fine-tuning. And also you have to keep in mind that I don't know the statistics on the average cost of a clinical trial per day today. However, several years ago, I was at an investigator meeting where we teach everyone who's going to conduct the trial how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember hearing the statistic that so they have all these milestones that we need to meet, like enrollment. If you're enrolling 300 people, we need to enroll all 300 by X date. For each day that they don't meet the enrollment date, it costs $1 million for the clinical trial.
Yeah.
So
pricey.
Right. So everybody's seriously motivated to do everything quickly. So that's phase 1 and phase 2. Then phase 3, we go. We're gonna have a blowout sale, and it's gonna be like 800, 2,000 people in the study. So we want to have a big cross section of people who have the condition, and we want to make sure that whatever we're testing treats the condition and doesn't cause too many untoward adverse
well,
events.
With pharmacogenomics, people know there's drug adverse reactions. So I'm surprised it's not at an earlier phase, because you could be testing it on someone who may have genetics that cannot, metabolize that drug. And so that poses a danger. I mean, is it controversial?
Yeah, we're not really there yet. So unfortunately, clinical trials technology lags a little bit behind.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's really expensive to do a clinical trial. And then if you start adding these unknown layers, right, that
it's true.
If insurance, and then you have to think, okay, if we include this data point that we're looking for, is the insurance company going to pay an extra $500 per prescription because we did this extra investigation?
Mm-hmm.
So
it's all about numbers,
cost-based, right? But there are some trials that are doing that.
Right. I mean, it could be dangerous for the person who's participating, is what I'm thinking.
And that's why we have informed consent.
Okay, yeah, that doesn't protect them.
Well,
what good does it do if they're dead? But you know what? That's probably another podcast.
Right.
I hear you. So that's when we start seeing some gaps, in the process. I think. There's, speaking of genetics, I get this question asked to me a lot, is there a difference between a blood test or genetics lab saliva test or buccal swab? Is there a requirement for the clinical trial if you were to have a genetic test done?
So, the Bible, so to speak, of a clinical trial is called the investigative protocol.
Mm-hmm.
And so the protocol lays out every single thing that happens during the trial. And so that would just be a preference. Again, for most things, it's going to be cost-based driven.
Mm-hmm.
So they're going to pick the one that they're going to get a valid response, right? And probably the least expensive.
Mm. So then the swab?
It just depends.
Yeah.
It's anything that has your DNA.
But then it's as reliable of data is what my question is.
Oh yes, it's the same. But what I have been most exposed to is saliva, where you spit into
A tube. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's a lot of spit.
Yeah. But, I mean, with Ancestry.com and 23andMe back in the day, I think I read some statistics that there were 40 million people worldwide that already have their saliva genetic test. So that could be accelerated if they already have the raw data, But the panel may not be comprehensive. I don't know.
And that kind of data usually could only be incorporated into the clinical trial if it was a retrospective study. So all the studies that we have discussed so far, the phase 1 through phase 3, are prospective, which means we're looking now and in the future. Retrospective is we looked back.
Right.
So we got permission from the patient at the time to look at their raw data, and then we compile that data and see if we can find any likeness, any trends, things like that, like the genetics that you're speaking about.
Yeah. So how long does it take to go through a clinical trial from end to end? I mean, it probably varies per project, but would you say smallest to longest?
What do you mean beginning to end? Do you mean
from phase 1 to?
Yeah. So the fastest example of that is what happened in our industry during COVID. We have thousands of people dying every single day.
Yeah.
Everyone was very, very motivated to do things quickly. They still made sure to do them safely. Just a lot more resources were thrown at the situation so that everything could be expedited. So I think the developments that came out of COVID are the fastest possible scenario.
Yeah.
But typically you go from compounding to phase 4, and it's going to be like
years,
more than
10 years,
10, 15 years.
Wow. Well, but with COVID, we kind of proved to ourselves that we can do it in an accelerated manner.
Yeah, but a big difference that happened during COVID was, yes, we can do it. However, the motivation essentially was every single person who worked on the trial, either in the clinic, hospital, for a sponsor, anyone that touched it, they knew people who either had died or maybe in the hospital, that kind of thing. And so it was such a motivating factor.
Yeah.
That doesn't exist with the flu.
It's true.
So it's difficult to reproduce that kind of timeline when it's not as critical as things were during COVID.
Yeah, I'm sure it could be a great topic for debates among lots of clinical trial professionals. But I'm also curious, since you've been doing this for a long time, has anything changed in the process since the early days of your career versus now? I bet technology, right?
Yeah, the biggest thing that's changed is technology and the way that we collect data. So when I first started over 20 years ago, all of the medical records in doctors' clinics and hospitals typically were paper-based. And now all of those records are in electronic form, known as an electronic medical record. So monitors would have to go out to the sites and compare the source data, which is the first place that data is recorded for the study, to what they've entered into an electronic database. And so that was very time-consuming. It's the most expensive part of a clinical trial. It still is with the increase in technology, but we've had a shift. So now that things are not paper-based, and they're electronic, then we can do some of our monitoring activities remotely, which has also caused another shift in the industry to where some parts of the clinical trial are being farmed offshore because it's more cost effective.
Mm-hmm. It's all about costs, isn't it, in this industry?
All of it. It's very expensive to develop. That's why you will see that the drug patents and device patents during the time that they have the patent, there is a big push to sell it because they have to recoup their investments.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. So speaking of costs and budget, you actually told me about this project, All of Us, the initiative that's supposed to advance the diversity of the data pool in research. But unfortunately, it's a very current topic at the moment with drops in federal funding. I read an article that speculated that there was a drop of 71% in the budget for this project compared to 2023. And, the ambition of the project is to recruit 1 million volunteers in the United States who agree to share their DNA and health records for precision medicine studies. And you and I talk about this all the time because we have diverse backgrounds, and it's important to us. So what impact do you think this could have in clinical research if we don't continue to get all the diverse data we need?
So I'm glad you brought this up. It's such an interesting topic. So first of all, this is something that I always say to anyone that I talk to clinical research about. I believe that any patient in any clinical trial who becomes a subject is better off than any person who doesn't, because you have additional surveillance from your study team, your medical team, that you're not going to get anywhere. It's not our standard of care. And so you have this increase of, care for whatever condition that you have. So I'm throwing that out there. And then secondly, I actually am a participant in the All of Us clinical trial. So they took my DNA and blood and urine and everything.
You're a specimen for sure.
Right. And, but I was very disappointed. I read the same statistic that you did, that they have had this type of drop in funding. I don't think, at least I hope, that it's not long term. I think it will be short lived, like 4 years. But that's just guessing.
Yeah.
So most of the things that I work on are not federally funded. They're privately funded, but it is going to very negatively impact the university settings in which a lot of academic research is done in the labs and that kind of thing. I can see that there's like some hiring freezes and things like that in those realms. I actually have a friend that works tangentially in another field, but in her business right now, because the funding was cut, her office went from 72 people to 30 people.
Yeah, we hear that a lot. I mean, we see these sad posts on LinkedIn. It does break my heart. But, thank you for educating us. I would like to know, though, if people wanted to participate in a clinical trial, how would they find the information?
So the best way, one of the requirements in this country is that every single clinical trial that is run is required to be listed on clinicaltrials.gov.
Right.
So you just go to there, and there's a search engine within clinicaltrials.gov, and you could enter something as simple as diabetes for your search term, or something very highly specified. you want a phase 3 trial for diabetes in Colorado that is currently enrolling.
Yeah.
Right? So that's clinicaltrials.gov. You can find anything for all the clinical trials there.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Tanya, so much
Thank you
for
for
bringing
having me.
your expertise in this. We're just, striving to educate everybody about different topics in healthcare.
Definitely.
And so it's been very enlightening. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with me. So that's
Thank you
all.
for having me.
Hey, you're welcome. I'm so glad. And I learned something about your basketball days. I'm going to have to try to shoot some hoops sometimes. I'm very lousy, just a warning. But all right, thanks, folks. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining in this episode of podcast for Health Schema. I hope we were able to provide you with useful information about clinical trials. And till next time, have a wonderful day. Bye for now.